Chapter 1. Achtung. I must have slipped into a parallel dimension. It was 1992, and the sound coming from the speakers was all at once alien, and yet somehow deeply familiar, as if it were speaking directly to my soul. I was alone in my apartment, listening over and over again to this odyssey of the psyche, as the twilight peered in through the sliding glass door directly in front of me. It even sounded like he said my name. How could that be? It can't be. But it is, I thought, and then said aloud, how is that even possible? It was the third track from the critically acclaimed new album, and as I held the CD in my hands, looking for answers, I wondered with astonishment. My lyrics were coming out of his mouth. My head began to reel as my heart was healing from ending a 2-year engagement. This album was supposed to be breakup medicine, but instead it was banging at the door of my memory, reminding me of something lost in time. I stared at the cover art on the CD in my hands, reading carefully, tracing with my fingers. Achtung, it said. I felt intrigued. How interesting that an Irish band would use the German word for attention to title their new release. Attention, baby. Well, they most certainly had mine now, more than ever before. I stared into space as my mind drifted back to where it all started, so many years ago, in Frankfurt, West Germany. It was cold, so cold that it crept into your soul. I remember the scents in the air, the buildings, whitewashed, all so close together, each visually blending into the next, ad infinitum. The sky was so overcast with shades of gray that it would cry to wash away the pain of the Second World War. There was a feeling of desolation. All I wanted to do was return stateside, back to New Orleans. But that wouldn't happen for a while. This was Frankfurt, the largest industrial city in West Germany, and it was my new home, away from home. But it didn't feel that way. It felt nothing like home. It felt nothing like New Orleans, a place where the air was so thickly sweet, you could taste the water droplets on your tongue while floating along through the summer heat. Magic would rise like mist from the city streets, inspiring you to chase the moon, then leaving you to dance with the moonlight. I moved to Frankfurt with my family in the summer of 1978 to become an American dependent living overseas, commonly referred to as a military brat. This term would somewhat define part of my earthly existence for years to come. We, my mother, sister, and I, left New Orleans in August of that year to spend time with my family in Kentucky before embarking on our long journey to Frankfurt. It was there that my father awaited our arrival. My father was in the Air Force before joining the Army Corps of Engineers and had been stationed in Korea for a year when I was 4 years old. When he returned, there was a strain on his relationship with myself and my mother. My sister Malaya was an infant, so she wasn't directly affected by his absence. When he rejoined the family, the distance between my parents continued to grow, ultimately becoming a chasm that none could cross, but they stayed together. When I say he awaited our arrival, it was a cold and somewhat emotionless waiting, just like my first experience of Frankfurt would be. He had gone 2 months ahead to get settled, begin working, and to find a place for us to live. He began the enormous task of in-processing to get all of the paperwork completed for each of us and started working. He did seem to like it there, giving us good reports of the city and his experiences. These descriptions were nothing like the Frankfurt that I met in September when the rest of us got there. There were nights so dark and frigid that my shadow would follow me home to make sure I arrived safely at my destination, with my angels ever vigilant. I always felt that I was being followed by something in Frankfurt, and as it turns out, I was. There was some kind of destiny waiting for me there that had its own designs, and though I participated in this creation, it would stop at nothing until they played out like a never-ending song. This song of love, created by destiny, was at times like a ballad, soft and sweet, whispering my name. Then suddenly, without warning and a roll of thunder, it would become a rock anthem, kicking ass and taking names. As if that weren't enough, it would transform itself again into a symphony, played by an orchestra so vast that choirs of angels could be heard singing. Driven by inspiration, it was the soundtrack for my life, but I digress. This is how the story goes. Growing up in New Orleans had taught me a few things: how to be soft and to love, how to cry, and how to be tough on the outside and warm on the inside, like melting snow. I knew how to keep people out and at a distance when necessary, but nothing prepared me for the education that I was about to receive on the world stage in Frankfurt. I remember riding the U2 line back and forth from Frankfurt am Main to Niedereschbach, where so much of my contemplation and musings began. I stared out of the window and disappeared into my sunlit memories of New Orleans and Kentucky, both places that I called home. At times, I would lose myself in the scenery, and my vast imagination filled with daydreams of beautiful things. Occasionally, I would break contact with my other world abruptly to find a German person staring at me. This was a very disconcerting sensation, and in the beginning, being only 14, I felt embarrassed or mortified. But after a time, I just felt angry. Why couldn't they just let me disappear into my deep imaginings of far-off places where I was surrounded by love? Why did they have to bring me crashing back from my secret paradise with the stairs? Often I was absorbed in one of my notebooks, passing the time by writing poetry or prose, to feel some cold, icy stare tingling at the edges of my senses. It was a culturally accepted German custom, and there was nothing that I could do except become the better of the two in the stare-down. So I did. I figured if you wanted to invade my inner world when not invited, then you were going to have to deal with the energetic consequences thereof. So I stared back, and I stared them down every time, unless I was too tired or just didn't care. I became the queen of the stare-down contest, and no one ever could remove my crown. I rocked it. As time passed, it became just a normal part of riding the U-Bahn, and like background noise, faded into the oblivion from whence it came. My first taste of Germany was the Frankfurt Flughafen, but I don't much remember it the way that I remember saying goodbye at the New Orleans airport to my friends. They came to see me off, and we hugged goodbye with tears in our eyes, not knowing if or when we would see each other again. The Flughafen, however, was monumentally large by comparison, crowded, and filled with signs I couldn't read, and people speaking in languages that I couldn't understand. The information overload was paramount when we arrived. Though many of the German people were helpful and kind, some of the people, however, were abrupt or plain rude, and tried to make us feel that we were less than they, most likely due to having witnessed Americans who lacked graciousness. For the most part, however, as a whole, the German people were some of the most beautiful, focused, methodical, and practical people that I had ever encountered up to that point, and I grew to love them and to love my new home very dearly. The first place that I do remember lodging in Europe was the Ambassador Arms Hotel, a somewhat smallish military welcoming place for new arrivals, with an underwhelming awning that belied the entire idea of welcome. We stayed there a short time before my father came to take us to our new home, a townhouse in a little village called Niedereschbach. It was there that I would spend the next 8 years of my life, learning, growing, being, and becoming what I was destined to be. Our new home was stark, much like the austerity of the whitewashed buildings that we passed on the way there, and decorated only by army green, surplus furniture. It left something to be desired, coupled with horsehair carpet on the floor in a pale reddish-purple color that left you wondering what color it really was. It was a duplex adorned in almost none of our own belongings, because it was 1/3 the size of our former home. None of us could believe that my father actually thought that it was large enough for the lot of us. The foyer was less than modest and boasted a tiny half bath off to the right and a door of frosted glass that led to the rest of the house. The kitchen was almost a shotgun style, with barely enough room for one person to move around, let alone 3 or 4. It was a virtual nightmare trying to seat everyone around the table to have a meal together. But when you did, you were intimately settled in for the duration. It took on a strange warmth as time passed because of the many talks and arguments had there. There was an unassuming living room and dining area with a lovely glass door and a large picture window looking out onto the back patio. This was framed by a lush, rich, vivid green yard, surrounded by trees and living things, with an 8-foot stone wall that separated us from our neighbors. At the far right corner of the yard, there was a hidden gate that led down a quiet path to the farms and fields of rolling emerald, almost as far as the eye could see. I spent many hours walking down this path through the countryside, feeling the magic of the spirits of nature, while my hair danced in the wind behind me. The first floor of the townhouse was given its mood by overpowering creaky wooden stairs, one set ascending to the second level and the other descending to the basement. Each floor had its purpose, with the ground level being utilitarian. Upstairs there were 3 bedrooms and 1 bath that looked on to the street that harbored a church, with my room being the first, immediately to the left, at the top of the stairs. The master bedroom was next to mine, where my parents slept and carried on their silent war with each other behind the stone wall. There was a small balcony off of the master bedroom, overlooking the backyard that doubled as an escape route from my window. It was situated close enough to the neighboring garage to jump to the roof and then to the ground with relative ease. My younger sister's room was located catty-corner to mine, next to the bathroom. At night, all the windows and doors were covered by the most amazing invention ever, the Rollladen. It was a thick wooden series of slats that were pulled down in the evening, creating privacy, dark, and quiet. In the morning, the Rollladen was pulled up inside the wall, allowing what little sun there was to stream through the windows and doors, inviting in the light of the new day. My room and the basement were my havens from the world and the family, when I needed time to sleep in the former and unwind in the latter. The basement had a second full bathroom and a laundry room, obviously built before the war, that also served as a bomb shelter. Turning left at the bottom of the stairs behind a door under the living area, there was an extremely large family room that gave me respite from everything. Though it was often cold, I would dig in there downstairs when I needed to sing or listen to my music loudly to avoid disturbing the family. Because the walls and floors were stone, you couldn't hear a thing from room to room. I felt at times that my own room was almost tomb-like in its silence. My twin-size bed was snuggled in next to the radiator and underneath the east-facing picture window, where I could look out and see the sunrise, other houses, and the fields of plenty with their pretty little rows lined up for harvest time. Nieder-Eschbach was a quaint little German village about 18 minutes by the U2 U-Bahn line away from Frankfurt am Main. So each day of my young life, I rode the U2 from Nieder-Eschbach to Heidenheim during the first year. The second year began the ride to Miquel Adikisali, debarking to walk to the Abrams complex and attend high school, or to hang out with friends. There was a lot more of the latter than there was of the former for at least 2 years. A frequent stop on either end of the trip was at the Trinkhalle, little German huts filled with neatly stacked items to eat and to drink that I found utterly fascinating. You could find anything from ouzo to Moncherie, my favorite little dark chocolate-covered cherries, suspended in liqueur, even bearing my name no less. They would warm me up with a fluid burst of flavor, tingling on the tongue during those long, cold walks to home, school, and other various more provocative locations. I dreaded the late-night walks from the Niedereschbach U2 station in the wintertime after some party or event because of the icy wind that would cut through every stitch of clothing, no matter how densely layered. I always felt a sense of relief when I made it to the church on the rounded corner, because that meant that home was just a few heartbeats away. Key in gloved hand, I knew that soon I would turn the lock on the door, opening up a place of warmth and love. No matter how fragile or flawed, it always waited for me there. Living catty-corner to a church evoked the sacredness and the mystery that was God to me, as I learned and grew there, emblazoned by the faithful. I was raised as a Christian, and I enjoyed the curiosity of having a church as a landmark to find my house, sometimes in the beginning when I would get lost myself. Later, on the rare occasions that I would give people directions to get there, it served its purpose as the lodestar that led to my residence. I found it easier to go out into the world to meet people than to invite them into my world. A magnitude of people and events shaped my life then. However, there were several happenings that seemed to carry more significance for my future, though every seemingly small experience was woven into a carefully crafted web of design by my Creator. My own presence seemed to have a powerful effect on many lives and events as well, although at the time I was oblivious to it. If pressed deeply enough, there was a part of me that knew it and was reluctant to believe it or to accept the burden of responsibility that it carried. I was precocious and mysterious, or so I was told, a precarious and precious mystery that none would solve. Ruled by my heart, I would sometimes make it appear that I was ruled by my head, or perhaps random chance. No, it was my heart, always, that secretly would push logic aside and rush in where angels and demons would fear to tread. And, as you might imagine, it got me into trouble more than once, though I was always rescued by grace or some stray angel or another. As an unidentified empath, I absorbed the energy of those around me, and the only way that I knew how to distance myself from this invasion was through anger. It acted as a shield before I understood what being an empath really was. I relied upon it heavily with my parents to keep their toxic relationship at bay. I used it more than once when all else failed, screaming at them to leave me alone. It was like armor that I called upon to protect myself, and most of all, my heart, from the obscenities of the world that made no sense to me. I was naturally a brunette, but due to frequent obsessing over my hair, I often appeared to be some shade of blonde. The reason that I would distress over my hair was because I never felt that I could get it quite right, the perfect that I would see on the covers of magazines or inside the windows of my own mind. This left me feeling somewhat insecure and inferior to the imaginary standards of perfection imposed upon myself and all girls in my culture at that time. The illusory idea of perfection, both physically and otherwise, loomed as an ideal that I could never quite master, so I just kept trying, at times spending hours to get myself right. This became tiresome, so by the time I was 16, I was able to pull myself together in an hour's time, instead of the exclusive preoccupation with my hair and makeup. Like the previous 2 years, I would sigh and feel that I had done the best I could that day to get as close to perfect as humanly possible. I learned that I always looked like or appeared to have it all together, even when falling apart. I was told that my eyes were one of my best features, so I would spend time accentuating what I could in the clear crystal blue of my eyes. I was also told that my behind was another one of my best features, something that was first communicated to me via wolf whistle by a boy in New Orleans. He later learned to express himself more appropriately after he realized that I didn't respond well to catcalls or the like. Still, there were those times that I would try on several pairs of jeans to see which one was the best fit for me. My younger sister told me that she thought I was perfect, and she never understood this little ritual. And yes, I did lie down to zip up some of the jeans in my collection, to the immense entertainment of my sister. Interestingly, people said that they loved my smile, something that I didn't believe for a long time. I didn't like my smile because I never had seen my real smile the way that others had. I tried to keep my vulnerability hidden, but apparently it didn't always work. My early days in Frankfurt were some of the darkest days that I have ever had in my life. I hated the middle school and felt trapped there, which was not surprising since it had been used as a prison for women during World War II. The boys were entirely too young for me there, as I was used to being around much older boys in New Orleans. The girls, though some had escaped it, were caught up in labeling, and by this I mean that I was told that there were 3 distinct groups, and that I had to choose the one for me. I was on a school bus at the time, going to a girlfriend's house for a sleepover, when this 9th grade revelation occurred. The girl that I thought was the sweetest of the bunch, Marin, told me very flatly that there were the blacks, the jocks, and the freaks, stating that I must choose one category. When I expressed my discontent at this offering of choices with my expression, she again said that these were the options, period. My memory drifted to a time in New Orleans for the talent showcase, where I attended Catholic school during the 8th grade. I searched high and low for the perfect song to sing for the 7th and 8th graders. I felt connected to Ben by Michael Jackson. I adored singing along with Michael's angelic voice. I rehearsed relentlessly, with steely determination to present on that sleepy sunshine day, and was able to perform it a cappella to an amazing reception. I never dreamed that I could inspire such a great artist the way that he had inspired me. The clock was ticking on Marin's face as I asked myself what far-out, bizarro world had I been dropped into, while thinking that this was the dumbest fucking thing that I had ever heard. We had not engaged in a lot of labeling where I was from, and it wasn't something that I wanted to be a part of at all. My mind flashed back again to New Orleans, after gym class, where the girls of all colors and cultures climbed up into the bleachers and sang together, making sweet harmonies. Marin's expectation brought me back abruptly to the present moment. Fine, I thought. I'll play along. So realizing that I wasn't black, narrowed down the choices some. I could be a freak or a jock. I certainly was not what I considered to be an athlete, nor did I have an interest in conventional sports. So again, the choice was pared down for me. What did these groups of people all do, and how did they interrelate? I queried at the tender age of 14. Well, I was told that the jocks played sports with a spin-off called the preps, and were more stuck up. The blacks were black and listened mostly to soul music. The freaks smoked weed, or whatever was available locally, and listened to rock music. Marin went on to say that freaks who played sports were a subcategory called frocks. It was best to stay within the 3 main groups, although, ultimately, you could call yourself whatever you wanted. As with any system that relies on superficial labels to exist, there were a few crossovers called various things. At certain times, the main groups would clash with each other and have rare fights over what seemed to me to be ridiculous reasons. Listening in complete disbelief to the discourse, I thought, insane much? I liked all kinds of music, but gravitated to rock music. I was interested in other parts of that equation because there seemingly wasn't much else to do if you weren't playing sports, supporting them, or black. So my choice was made for me. I knew that I would move between groups with relative ease, ignoring the need for separation, because I'm a rebel. Later in high school, there was one interracial couple that would walk the halls hand in hand, demonstrating the power of love to overcome all barriers. I always smiled at them and acknowledged their courage to be unapologetically who they were, with grace. In the meantime, I said to Marin, rejoining the conversation on the bus, "Well, I guess I'll be a freak then." I was trying not to sound like I felt, which was contemptuous of any social system that engaged in classifying people instead of allowing them the freedom to be who they were without judgment. Granted, these views were the limited views of the 9th grade middle school students that, to me, seemed like the coolest of the group. There were many days during the 9th grade that I would wait until my family left the house in the morning and stay home from school, lie in bed, and pray to die. It didn't work. The winter was long, dark, and cold. We had a terrible signal for the Armed Forces Network, so television was a rarity. I was given a King James version of the Bible by my father that had an old-style leather binding and cover. Appearing as though it was from antiquity, it inspired me to seek out any ancient wisdom that might be buried within its pages. It was one of the only things that he ever gave to me that I found to be of value, and I still have it to this day. When I expressed an interest in reading about the life of Jesus, he gave it to me, telling me that it was his very first Bible. I'm sure he hoped that it would make me more religious, in the same way that he was, attending church and such. With no television to speak of, I took to reading it on those icy winter nights, curled up in bed, under my feather quilt, next to the radiator. I would always turn to the Gospels, where the words of Jesus were highlighted in red. I would read knowing the end that was coming, and yet continue on hoping to gain some kind of insight into what I was doing on planet Earth at this time. I wore a cross around my neck and prayed for protection, while I asked for forgiveness for all of my apparent shortcomings and mistakes. I would cycle through the Gospels, reading each, yet there was one that became my favorite, that being the Gospel of John. Inevitably, each time that I would reach the end, I would find myself overcome by sobs and tears, asking myself, God, and the universe, why? This heartfelt query was brought on by a remarkably simple statement, rendered as Jesus was dying on the cross, when he looked to heaven and said, "Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do." That act of compassion, to me, defined Jesus along with his last commandment, "Love each other as I have loved you." I found it hard to understand the vastness of the incomprehensible dual nature of human beings that I had read about in history books or heard about from the evening news. I was experiencing two particularly important cognitive states. One of these states was called culture shock, and it was very real. The other was called cognitive dissonance, which was the disbelief associated with the idea that most everything that I had been taught stateside about how Americans were perceived in the world at large was in fact wrong. It was mind-blowing. I was seeing a completely different view laid out right before me through the unfolding of actuality and the reality of the situation. And that, my friend, was quite a different story.